land acknowledgement from here in the District of Columbia, where I landed about 8 months ago. We are on the ancestral lands of the Nacotchtank and the Piscataway people, and so we pay respects to their elders past and present. Please take a moment to consider the ancestors in your own place and the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us all here today. I'm Elias Krim. I'm the founder of Solidarity Hall, and a new project I'm going to throw in a quick mention of called the solidarityworkshop.com. We just launched last week, and we are a kind of combination of a wisdom exchange, as we say, rather loftily, and a community of practice. So check us out at communityworkshop.com. We're just getting started. And in some ways, this book launch is very much kind of under our area of interest. So it's great to have Emmy and Matt here today. I'm going to let each of them introduce themselves so it'll be exactly accurate. And I've known Matt for a bit. I've just met Emmy, which is great. So Emmy, I understand you're going to say a little bit about how the book came to be written and kind of what's behind the project.
Sure, yeah. So I'm Emmy. I am currently on the ancestral territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam peoples in Vancouver, Canada. And I was invited to join on this book project through Matt, who was had recently moved to Colorado and had linked up with George Cheney, who had been approached to write a book about worker co-ops. And so I'm going to just jump right into that rather than give an introduction about myself. Is that okay? Yeah. Sure. So it was an interesting project when the three of us first got together and started scoping out the idea behind the book and what we wanted to cover in it, because worker co-ops is a model, and yet what we thought and the impact in terms of our relationship to work and how that can be transformative for how we interact as people in society. The circles and the areas of influence started getting so huge, it became harder and harder to narrow down. And so I think the chapters of this book kind of like helped us to constrain some of those thoughts into these different areas that we thought they were still huge. And you'll see that the scope of this book is quite broad, but it helped us to sort of contain our big ideas into these different sectors. We alluded to this a little bit at the beginning when talking about the fact that there are 6 co-authors, but this book was written cooperatively. And I've been part of other book projects where each author sort of takes a chapter, writes it, and then somebody sort of makes sure that there's not a lot of overlap and squishes it all together and calls it a book. And that is not what happened in this process. There was a period, especially in the last year when this book was coming together, where we were literally writing the same sentence together. And we were sending those back and forth. And we are actually all located in different parts of the world. And so a lot of that coordinating was happening online, and was facilitated by the fact that we are so digitally connected. So that gives you a little bit of a backgrounder as to how this book was written and why it feels so special and meaningful to, I think, all of us. Matt, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, no, I think that's great. I think that it was a really unique experience in terms of the collaborative writing. Kind of astonishing. So when I read the book now, it's really fun to try to remember, like, okay, so who wrote which sentence and how did that all get mixed together? Because every chapter has everybody's voice in it. It's a kind of amazing process. Yeah, so I'm Matt, and I'm in Colorado. Ancestral lands of something like 48 different peoples. I mean, it's the Front Range of the Rockies is just a very mobile place with lots of different people's experiences, and a lot of expropriation. and that same history. Um, I wanted to just mention that, we were hoping to have George Cheney and Marcelo Vieta on this call. And George had a medical appointment he couldn't miss. He really wanted to be here, but he wasn't able to. And Marcelo, his hometown in Costa Rica, the electrical co-op decided that today is the day they had to go offline to do some maintenance. So he lost all power for today.
Oh, no.
So that's just life. But we'll try to represent the book as well as we can, just with the two of us. George really was a lead author on this project, and a lot of the sort of most graceful writing in it is George's writing, kind of pulling ideas together, and so we really want to make sure that that's recognized. Otherwise, I'm here just working on, in Colorado, been trying to figure out how to be helpful in developing cooperatives and solidarity economy approaches, and working with a number of folks, wonderful people here, on trying to get food system organizing going. And so that's been my sort of engagement on a practical level.
Wonderful, wonderful. All right, well, let's jump right in. I want to say I was very struck by the fact that this book took such a wide angle, by which I don't mean it doesn't contain lots of juicy details, including, projects, co-ops, initiatives from all over the place, many of which I'd never heard of. But I was appreciative of the fact that the structure is essentially that you have a kind of a first chapter that gives a co-op overview. The next chapter is about democracy. The next chapter is about innovation. And then you go to community, to environment, and finally education. So those are big umbrellas. And it's sort of striking that co-ops have something to do with all of those, So that's pretty interesting in itself. Just to kind of jump into the beginning, the first chapter is pretty useful because there's a history of co-ops, a short one. There's a discussion of the famous 7 principles, some useful stats on co-ops and various types of co-ops. And then you also get into a very interesting thing, which I think maybe is in the back of your minds with this book, which has to do with the risk of creating organizations which are not completely authentic. And there have been instances in history where, in fact, co-ops were, misappropriated by various national governments and used for all kinds of bad ends and so on. So the question of co-op values and how they embed their values in the organizational structure is kind of a striking idea, given how difficult that sounds to do. I wonder if you could both maybe comment on how that works. How are co-ops even able to do that, given that business organizations are so easily captured, bought up, repurposed, and so on?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I was thinking before today that, in addition to, when we're talking about co-ops, in addition to kind of a land acknowledgement, I feel like we need a co-op history acknowledgement, because although people often tell the story as if it started in England, and it becomes a very Anglo-American or Anglo-European kind of history. And as Jessica Gordon-Emhart has shown, in terms of the history of African-American cooperative economic organizing, but also other writers have talked about around the world, cooperative economics is a long and very diverse history, and it doesn't dovetail exactly with the Rochdale pioneers in England. And part of that history, as Elias sort of referred to, is, for example, in Southern Africa, co-ops were intentionally integrated into white supremacy. That was the concept. In Central Africa, we found that people had, that co-ops were part of the colonial project, but then they also became part of the anti-colonial project. And so there's a very interesting and complicated history. And that all gets back to these questions, right, about the principles, the values, the authenticity of co-ops. So I guess I would say one of the things that really struck me, so when we wrote this book, we decided not we decided on purpose to try to make it global, to try to interview people from around the world. And it's all based on interviews. We did like this over, I don't know, we did like 60. There were more that we got through Marcelo's work. So it was really a lot of different voices. And one of the most surprising was this group in Venezuela, Seco Se Sola. It's the acronym for a much longer name. And they, I asked them, do they have a statement of principles or values? And they said, no, we don't have one, and we don't want to have one. We used to have one, they said, but we don't have one, and we don't now, and we don't want to, because instead of a statement of values, what they have is an ongoing, constant process of conversation about values. So the values are alive. And I think that's a really key insight into the question of authenticity and developing a living cooperative culture and having real values. So I think that's kind of, for me, that's one key entry point, is the idea of living values. And then the other thing I'll just mention is that people are reinventing the values all the time, and they should be. And so, for example, in that history of that question of co-op history acknowledgement, Cooperation Jackson in Mississippi, the way they recreated the concept of social transformation is all about the history of Africans in the Americas. So that's a good example of kind of how the values have to be alive and have to be regenerated.
Yeah. Amy, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think something that kind of pinged for me when you were asking your question about the difference between co-ops and regular businesses, and why co-ops are able to live their values a little bit more, or could have the potential to live more authentic to their values, is sort of also what makes people afraid of co-ops. I think this idea of, oh my gosh, all of the conversations, I have to compromise with all of these other people in running this business. And yet that slowing down of that process of having different voices being raised, and I think allows for some of those easily like misallocated or misaligned values to not be. They're uncomfortably raised by co-owners of a business, and that comes through for me in the interviews that we've had.
Yeah, great. I want to come back, by the way, Matt, to is it pronounced Seco Se Sola? Yeah, let's come back to that project. That's an amazing thing. You mentioned the fact that moving up to democracy, this is a powerful idea. The idea that workplace democracy builds political democracy. I don't think this is at all well understood. And I guess we would quickly say, particularly in the US, whatever most workplaces are, not many are democratic, right? So that's a whole different issue. But given the fact that there are so few co-ops and democracy is not thought of as something that even belongs in a workplace, that's a really uphill battle. But it is wonderful to realize that is part of what co-ops accomplish. And so maybe it'd be a good moment to talk a little bit about this group that most people have never heard of, Seco Se Sola, and their unusual organization. They come from back in the 60s. I noted in the book, there are now 80 community organizations in the co-op and 20,000 members. So it's really it sounds like a whole regional ecosystem in a way.
Yeah, it was astonishing. It's like talking with them was really eye-opening. There's more information. There's some good articles about them. Recently, geo.coop, where Josh is the editor and kind of running the website, Josh has done a great job of bringing up articles from and about Seco Se Sola. So there's some recent material there. But yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. I think you mentioned in the previous question, there's this question of sort of baked in values, which is what people talk about. And And I think it's important in co-ops, the primary baked in value really is democracy. And that's one reason why the cooperative form is so important and so interesting, is because unlike other forms, democracy is really built into the structure of it. And you can, of course, water that down or try to change it if you want to, but it takes effort because the form is actually a democratic form. In Seco Se Sola, I think what their great kind of discovery was that it's not about just the structures. It has to be about the living culture. And the democratic living culture is a culture in which people are in conversation about not just logistics, but about who they are and about why they're together and about what it is that they're trying to accomplish and how they understand it. And so everything, that's how they handle not only decision making, but also the culture building, and it's how they handle conflict. They handle everything through this very kind of constant conversation process. And it is interesting because it would make you wonder, like, how on earth can an organization function if they're always having meetings? Yeah. But there is a whole kind of efficiency and productivity that comes from cooperation, collaboration, communicating, all these C words. And that's what they're very good at. That's like their great strength, is learning how to tap into that and organize it.
Yeah. Any thoughts on that, Penny?
No, I think Matt always talks so beautifully about them.
All right. Well, now, I was fascinated. The chapter on innovation. This is kind of like a problematic word for me anymore. I'm much more interested in maintenance and repair than I am in innovation, I think, compared with my views a few years ago. But under that heading, there's the question of, you talk about the question of scaling versus replicating, you know? And so that's a great subject in itself. We hear all the time that the problem with our solidarity work is that it hasn't scaled up big enough. There's only one Mondragon, you know, and so on, and that sort of thing, which that's quite true. And then there's another point, which is what happens at scale. You know, there's a question about whether scaling has some drawbacks, and the model we want is not so much scaling rather than replicating. So anyway, any thoughts on that and innovation in general?
So I just want to point out, the reason I'm answering first on these first three questions is just because we divided it that way. So in case anybody's thinking like, Jesus, what is this guy? He's just going to keep answering all the questions first. But this chapter, yeah, so innovation, this is fascinating. So one little thing, I think you're probably more interested in innovation than you think, Elias, just because the etymology of the term is fascinating. Innovare, the Latin word, was often at the origin is very similar to renovare. It's very much a concept originally of regeneration. And in religious history and some theological history, it's that very deep idea of reinvention, reemergence, and rebirth, right? But at one point in history, the church actually kind of shifted the definition of innovation to mean heresy. And innovation was when you created a new doctrine outside of the accepted body. All of that gets erased by industrial capitalism. And industrial capitalism just completely changes the meaning of the word to what we're familiar with, which is really innovation as a piece of competition. So when we talk about innovation now, we're really talking about capitalist competition and the kind of technological arms race that it involves. So that's what the issue, but the real, there's a deeper conversation about innovation that's much more interesting than that. But the scaling up thing, Namaste Solar is a solar company in Boulder, Colorado. They were very successful. They're a worker cooperative, very successful. They decided to grow and spread across the United States. And they soon realized that they didn't want to be a national cooperative. Because it was creating problems of coordination and problems of management and problems of organization and democracy. So they shifted to what's more, some people call like the strawberry plant model, which is like, rhizomes, like shooting off little sub
Yes.
plants. So instead, what they created were two second level co-ops that are kind of provide shared resources and coordination for multiple independent worker co-ops. And this is similar to the model at Mondragon originally, where you have this kind of central coordinating, but it's all based on these autonomous worker co-ops, networked in that way. So that model of scaling out as opposed to scaling up is common in a lot of cooperatives. It seems to be a very, like, that's a popular option, or an option that seems most aligned with what people are trying to do. And we've seen that in a bunch of different cases. So I think that's one way people are really dealing with this question of scaling up. Because scaling up implies centralization. It implies concentration of decision making, concentration of resources. There's a lot in that can be very problematic for going the opposite direction. Seco Sisolo would be another example of that, right? Multiple cooperatives all functioning in a kind of networked, coordinated body.
Yeah. Any thoughts on that, Amy?
Just to say that I thought the innovation chapter was exciting because it reframed innovation in exactly the way that Matt was just speaking to. And I think it was really fun to grapple with this question, this feeling that we also shared with you, Elias, where we're like, well, like, disruption sounds horrible, and especially because there is this sort of myth of co-ops being Luddite, or I think an image that we capture in the chapter is like this artisanal bakery as like this image that everyone has of a worker co-op. But that there are worker co-ops that are in this like traditionally innovative space, engineering co-ops, like Mondragon is often cited as such, being at the cutting edge. And yet that's actually not the story, right? The story is the fact that worker co-ops themselves, by trying to recapture what it means to work well together, are being really socially innovative, and that is something that we don't often talk about.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, if I could add one thing to that, because that Emmy reminded me, that's like totally the key thing is there was a kind of aha moment when I realized that Tina, Thatcher's famous "There is no alternative," is like the most profoundly anti-innovative thing you could say, right? There's nothing that can be changed.
Right.
But and that's exactly where the value of worker cooperatives is for us, is that the possibility, not just worker cooperatives alone, but in the context of greater networks and greater collaboration, it's precisely the alternative to the thing we most need an alternative to right now, which is the capitalist extractive system, which is destroying us, right? So that's what we really are up against. And this is where cooperatives can be innovative in a way that means something quite different than just creating the next new product.
That's good. That's good. I'm noticing Caitlin's good comments in the chat here, and also think about the fact that, I've been looking at the Italian social co-op model, and I'm learning that one of the things that makes that work is that we're not, in Italy, they're not dealing with one co-op at a time. You create your new social co-op as part of a consortium. So there's this whole back-end system, you might call it. It's a bit like a supply chain. And it's a great sign of the generally collaborative nature of that more kind of human scale economy. Italy is not dominated by large corporations. Quite the contrary, it's a very kind of middle-sized economy. But what that enables is a lot of this kind of supply chain collaboration. And it just makes it so much easier to get into business and stay in business if you've got that those forces that work around you, as opposed to what we really have in this country. So, and that is an innovation. It's an innovation that you would think we might have wanted to pick up by this point, but we haven't yet. And there are various reasons why that hasn't happened, but I'm hopeful maybe that can change. Let's talk about community. And so there's a lot of good stuff on that topic as well in the book. And I want to say, there's I'm grabbing my notes here to remind myself. Solidarity, for example, rather than capital, as the organizing principle of the new economy. And you point to this wonderful group in South America, the Buen Vivir movement, which I've been watching also. And it's an example this way in which the first world is gradually realizing that we actually do not seem to be very advanced in many ways. And instead, we're finding models, including social models, that are coming from the global south, this being a great one. But I wondered if maybe you could say a little bit about the way in which, community, as we discover it in these alternative models from the global south, are teaching us something using Buen Vivir or any other examples that might come to mind.
Yeah, just to back up on community in general, I think much like where we sort of stumbled with innovation, just even what we referenced to when we think of community was kind of our starting point, where we were like, wait, what even is community? We use community in so many different ways. And then we're like, okay, well, originally the title was community well-being. Then what's well-being? And I think from there, we spiraled into thinking about, okay, well, and what's the relationship between co-ops and well-being? Well, co-ops allow for whole people to show up. And, Buen Vivir came in at a moment where when we started thinking about that idea of well-being and how we have conceptualized that. Originally we were breaking it down into health. Okay, so what is the effect of worker co-ops on individual health? Oh, and then what's the impact of worker co-ops on the community, like around food, like food sovereignty? And I think when you sort of like stop trying to silo all of these benefits into tiny little categories and instead think of it in a bigger sense, and Buen Vivir, to live well, what does that mean, was really helpful. And it came, so coming across that model and way of thinking, that framework was really helpful for us. In terms of like lessons to be learned from co-ops that we interviewed, I'm going to actually pull on not an example from the South, but one that actually springs to mind first and was a really powerful interview for me, was the example of Chai Fresh in Chicago.
Okay.
And they're a cooperative of, they were founded by formerly incarcerated people with the help of a community organizer. And I think for me, where this captures it is that they were so connected to all the different initiatives within their community that sprang forth and to me represent sort of the different facets of life. And so, they were connected to the urban food movement. They were tapped into the needs of the individual workers in terms of finding gainful work, empowerment. And they were an initiative that really came up because of a direct need in their community for healthily prepared food that could be distributed. So I think that was a really great co-op for us to find and to feature.
Very good. That's a wonderful project. I agree. Yeah. Matt, play anthropologist here for a moment. Buen Vivir comes from the Andean cultures, right? It's a Spanish.
Yeah, there are many. There in many different languages. There are different terms.
Yeah.
So Buen Vivir is kind of like the Spanish, equivalent of really what are like a dozen different terms in as many different languages, and it's a complicated sort of. Someone has described it as a hybrid concept because it involves, on the one hand, it involves drawing on indigenous traditions and current struggles and history and ways of
Yeah.
thinking. At the same time, those are wrapped up with and in a dialogue with other social movements.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a kind of mixed concept, but I think the thing that distinguishes it is that it doesn't take for granted many of the things that theories of development in particular do. The kind of ideas of some idea of progress as meaning more and more growth, economic
Yep.
growth, and economic growth just meaning increases in GDP. And this whole kind of extractive model and this very sort of the nature is this objective thing that we use as a material. All of those concepts that are historically sort of very European and colonial in origin are challenged. And so people have described it as like a different cosmology, like a different fundamental way of thinking
Yeah.
about your relationship to the world and nature.
Mm-hmm.
So, but it's a very broad and plural thing
Yes.
with many different practices and concepts. So
Yes.
it's really inspiring. One of the things I most want to learn more about coming out of this process is those more about the work that's involved there.
Yeah. My sense of it is that it's a kind of combination of popular movements in several different countries, all coming up from indigenous cultures, which have realized, I guess, in a way, they need to organize and begin to formalize the whole discourse around their way of life, because something else is running at them at top speed. Modern development, particularly around the Amazon, which is where I associate, and the Andes, which is where I associate this term. But it's a big, powerful movement and really quite inspiring, because it's really kind of an autonomous effort here, or an effort toward autonomy for a whole culture and a whole way of life, which is really a striking moment to be in, so.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The other thing I would add is that the other thing that we discovered, Emmy described it perfectly, like we had this word community, and it just kept getting more problematic the more we looked at it. But one of the things that we realized is that and just like there was a transition in the idea of innovation as we started looking at it towards more thinking about social transformation, the same thing happened in community, and same thought about the importance of solidarity in as a way of understanding what we often talk about when we talk about community. So that was another interesting kind of shift in perspective.
Yeah, very good. It also occurs to me that in terms of the next chapter we want to talk about around the environment, Buen Vivir is also about the environment. It's very much about that embeddedness in nature and just being so much more aware and intentional about that. You make the point, and this is interesting, I hadn't thought about this, that co-ops still have not quite internalized ecological principles for the most part, as much as they should. And yet that is part of, what are now being thought of as measures of well-being. And well-being, I'm finding that last summer, for example, we did a webinar with New America that had to do with a topic of good work. And this came up because of some conversation that and research New America was doing on the idea of replacing GDP. Well, so what do we call the replacement? And, one option, one idea is well-being, because there's so many national governments that are looking at this and finding ways to talk about it, to measure it, and so on. And our thought at Solidarity Hall was, well, one way you would know where well-being is to be found is to find people that believe they have good work and are doing good work. And that's not necessarily a large number of people. So we thought it would be a great opportunity, because cooperators generally would say, this is not like ordinary work. This is a different thing we're doing, right? So this is like playing on a winning soccer team or something. It's a different kind of feeling, particularly if your co-op is doing well, right? Or your business is doing well. So we talked about good work as kind of a way of capturing where this is happening on the ground. If you policy people want to know what well-being looks like, particularly in the workplace, here's where to look. So we put up a couple of webinars, on that subject. So well-being, it turns out, may be a lever. It could be a lever for the co-op conversation, because co-ops deliver so many aspects of that ideal that I think we kind of naturally, or hopefully, will naturally come up in the conversation. You also mention in this chapter the idea, and this is very striking, that we're reaching a point where, in terms of stakeholders in co-ops and the kind of expanding conversation around what they should be, not only who they should be, but what they should be, you came across, I think this is probably in Latin America, the idea that rivers, mountains, forests, and deserts might even become stakeholders when you're looking at the larger impact of your organization's practices. So let's talk a little bit about these larger ecological concerns, and what other projects and examples came up in the research around this.
Yeah, I think I was looking for kind of a silver bullet when we were looking for examples. We were looking for a co-op that, explicitly stated, yeah, we have the environment as a stakeholder, and we incorporate their needs in the same way that we incorporate all of our member needs, and they have a voice in the decisions that we take. And I don't think we concretely came across a co-op that was explicitly doing that. And that's what we were hoping for. But I think first we came across many who are, and I think Leo kind of summed it up. He was like, well, just because by nature of a lot of co-ops being locally embedded organizations and whose members are living in that environment, they're not going to take a lot of the detrimental, kind of extractive practices that somebody who isn't as invested in their environment are going to take. And so there is this already, again, that democratic or representative nature of co-ops sort of factors in without us being able to account for it tangibly. I think there is also a really interesting feeling from maybe looking at it from a theoretical perspective of wanting that explicit commitment to, but in terms of the co-ops that are doing it, Earthworker in Australia being a great example.
Yeah.
And they were just like, you know what, there's no time. We're not going to talk about it anymore. We're just going to do the things that need to get done in order for us to really shift work and outputs into the direction that we need it to go in. These are the needs of our community. This is what gaps there are. And so let's fill it. And I think that kind of action-oriented nature of sort of the business solution or the work solution is really great and just as valuable. And sometimes the romantic philosophical side wants some of the more the incorporation of these bigger values and ideas in tangible ways. And yet I think in the ways that people are moving, it is embodied in less concrete, explicit terms.
Yeah. Any thoughts, Matt?
Yeah, I mean, exactly that. I mean, Earthworker really stood out. Its origin, it was fascinating. Their origin, it was from the labor movement, came out of the labor movement and the environmental movement in Australia, which have a longer history of interaction. So there's been a lot of collaboration between those two movements, and it's sort of radical labor environmental folks. And exactly as Emmy said, they were like, we just don't have time. The traditional political strategy of change that we had in mind for shifting on the environment, we don't have time for it. So we have to actually use with resources that are available to us to create the economy we need now. And that's their strategy. And it's really quite amazing. The other great thing is they are offering to partner with people. And they're doing this actually now with one of the worker recuperated factories, like factories that have been taken over by workers in Argentina. One of those, they have a partnership with Earthworker to try to see if they can develop the same kind of approach. So they're a great example of worker co-ops has integrated into it, coming out of social movement orientation. So it's in the US, I think a lot of times we think of co-ops as an alternative business model.
Mm-hmm.
You can have an ESOP, you can have a co-op, you can have a B Corp, you can have, but really what's most inspiring to us that we've seen, or where co-ops are understood as part of one of the vehicles in a larger social movement.
Yeah.
And that kind of vision of cooperativism is really different. Just the other thing, I was like, we were shocked, I think, because we had hoped coming in, we wanted environment to be at the center of what we were doing.
Huh.
And we kind of expected more co-ops would have internalized the idea. Naomi Klein said, this changes everything, was the title of her book, right?
Yeah.
And that should mean it changes everything. Like even the strategy of co-ops ought to be changing if this crisis is as she described it. And we found that co-ops were responding to the crisis because everybody has to, but there weren't that many that were really incorporating it into their strategy. Another one that stood out was Sustainability Solutions Group, where Emmy actually now works. And they do, it's their business is exactly trying to address the climate emergency. So there are examples out there, but fewer than we expected. So that's something for the co-op movement to think about.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, that leads us pretty well to the last chapter about education and the need for that. I will say, just recently, for some reason, I've noticed some wonderful new resources around this topic. One of them I might just mention is the Lift Economy, which has an MBA program. This is not your uncle's MBA program. And now they've published a book of essentially a lot of the content from the MBA program. And it's very much about solidarity and sustainability and all those good things. There's also Economics for Liberation, which is from the Center for Economic Democracy in Boston. And then the wonderful Anti-Racist Facilitators Guide, which is kind of a startup manual, a co-op incubation manual that just came out a couple of weeks ago and is bouncing around in the co-op internet realm. Wonderful work, amazing work with Camille Carr, the founder of Chai Fresh Kitchen, and Maru Batista and some other good people. So it's great that this infrastructure is beginning to be filled in terms of not only kind of organizations, but also sort of the intellectual capital that's coming together. But, I want to quote something from the book that was so striking to me. It's I think the letter you might have received from Alberto Irizabal, who is in Mexico City and is the director of the International Center for Research on the Social and Solidarity Economy at the Universidad Iberoamericana. And he sent a letter about being on the board of a very remarkable coffee co-op. You know where I'm going with this, Amy? Yomal Atel, which is part of the Comparte network in Mexico and some other countries as well. And so he became a board member. He's kind of a city guy, and he goes out to Chiapas and he explains that becoming a board member of this Chiapas-based sort of indigenous co-op was a very different experience. And here's what he explained. The process involved traveling from village to village, meeting with members, and fasting and staying awake for 24 hours of community prayers and reflection. He added, by walking the work in the company of other members, you make a profound commitment to accountability and collective responsibility before everybody. And it becomes their responsibility to walk with you in terms of their commitment. Alberto noted that in rural settings, it's easier to recover an identity that is not only social or even human, but embraces other species and elements. as in the cosmological vision called buen vivir. Wow. So that's part of this rewiring, this relearning around business and economics and all the rest of it it's part of our conversation today. Any other thoughts on education and how this chapter came together?
Yeah, I mean, this was a really tough chapter to write because we were, yes, wanting to talk about education, but also wanting to sum up the book. And in so many instances, well, what we really found, and I mean, your example, like the quote that you pulled, yeah, I've like forgotten about it, and it's kind of really nice to be reminded about how striking it is. But this idea of, I'm going to butcher this quote, Matt, that cooperatives are as much like they are an education project as much of a, what is it? Yeah. But I thought that was like the heart of what we were trying to write about, was this, we talk about all the time in these pithy quotes about how it's not the destination that is the goal, it's the journey. And I think the cooperative learning mentality of, hey, we're here to learn together on how to work better together, on how to be better together, on is wonderful. And I think a lot of the examples that we pull from of the different cooperative learning and education methods really draw on that, how it's about being present in that moment and being connected in that moment, and not just always aspiring to when we do that, that's going to be, right now, it's okay that we're exploiting ourselves, or we're doing, because we're really just working towards this end goal of perfection. No, it's about right now and about how we're doing it. And again, like that connection with Buen Vivir about there not being a linear timeline of this whole, like, kind of like throwing away our concepts of time and really focusing on like what is happening in the present, I think really resonated for me.
Yeah. Any thoughts, Matt?
Yeah, I think, it was a fascinating chapter. Charlie Michael, who's the sixth author, was one who sort of initiated that chapter and kind of got the thing rolling. He's doing amazing work now with the Northwest Food Hub Network. But this concept, the Arismendi quote is, you can talk about co-ops as being a business that has a significant educational component, or an educational project that has a significant business component, which is great. And it's totally true in our experience. And then that's like, again, the most dynamic, the places where we felt the most life and the most potential and the most excitement and really potential for social transformation, which again is something that we really need right now. It's not just a kind of lovely thing it would be nice to have. It's something we actually desperately need. Was in those organizations where learning is fundamental to the process. It's not just training, it's actual mutual education and learning. And that applies to more than just, I think that's what Alberto's experience was. He came down thinking he was going to help talk to them about how to organize a cooperative and with proper structures and stuff like that. And he realized that he had to learn that cooperation in that context was this seamless integration with so many aspects of the community, that to cooperate meant to be involved with and engaging with people on all these other levels. And that just kind of, it's an amazing experience. It kind of really set him back. But he learned a lot from it. And I think that's true under different conditions and in different ways in other cooperative experiences.
Yeah, I'm inviting people to drop questions in the chat, or if you prefer to recognize and go on, recognize us, or rather be recognized, I think Josh can do that for you, and you'll pop up on the screen. The other thing I was thinking about in terms of education, and I get this in the chapter as well a bit, and that is there's a lot of sort of unlearning that you do as you sign up for a co-op and you're thinking you're in a small business and maybe you've had a couple of business classes, or even the unfortunate experience of going to a business school and having learned all those bad ideas, and then you have to kind of rip them all out. But it's really a revisioning of economic activity altogether that we're talking about. And I agree with your earlier point, Matt. It isn't just a choice of a business model among several. There needs to be a recognition that something else, something bigger is going on here. You know, sometimes we talk about principle 6, right? The fact that unlike the rest of the economy, mostly, co-ops cooperate with, collaborate with, even interoperate with other co-ops.
Yeah.
So that's a very radical, unusual idea. The places where it works, you can see why they do it. And it's one of the keys to Mondragon's success is that interoperability, you know. But to learn that, that's not a quick thing. That's really quite a few meetings, quite a bit of time to understand how to do it in a different way, right? So,
Yeah, and I think that, you know, the springboard for a lot of these explorations for us was that, you know, there are so many resources like available for how to start a co-op, you know, co-op 101.
yeah.
And many of them immediately after being like, these are the 7 principles, goes immediately into, and this is your first step is writing a business plan. And we thought that was so interesting, you know, like here we talk about, you know, the chapter 3 was all about innovation and how we're talking about an alternative, and yet we immediately want to be trying to fit right into the market economy, because it is a really like easy to understand organizing its element. Like, okay, we really want to convene. How do we organize our thoughts? How do we organize our meeting? How do we organize collective action? Oh, we're going to do this one thing that we actually that we think we understand because we've been, you know, raised in it, embedded in it, stewing in it, you know. And so that unlearning that needs to happen can take so many different forms. And we explore some of them, you know, like, you know, Matt, Josh and I did a speculative fiction group so that we could embody that experience of working and living and experiencing the consequences of certain types of decisions that you might make as a co-op. You know, in Lane, their university program, they have students try, you know, to start co-ops and experience what that's like. I think sort of like that living and experiencing that is so important.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. I'm noticing some questions popping in here from Caitlin. Anybody want to speak to state level support of employee ownership offices? Colorado is famous for this now. What kinds of co-ops are they supporting? Are they effective? Matt, you're right there. How's it going?
Yeah, I'm sort of right there.
Yeah.
I just want to mention, by the way, Caitlin was also in our speculative fiction group. There were a number of folks. It was an amazing experience. But yeah, okay, so it's true. Colorado is sort of famous because it has very good cooperative laws. And the current governor is very much in favor of worker ownership in some form or another. Mm-hmm. And so there is more support here. I think Vermont has also got a lot of support. There are a number of states where there's more potential or whatever, more active infrastructure. Mm-hmm. The thing in Colorado is it's very much focused on Denver, which is the capital city. So I'm in Colorado Springs, which is about 700,000 people. And the resources here are completely different.
Huh.
So that's there's a kind of regional thing. Also, I think what has been happening in the interesting challenge for folks has been that there is actually some really good support infrastructure for people who want to start co-ops. Mm-hmm. There aren't that many people trying to start co-ops. So there's a process of, I think we need more organizing in order to make use of the support. So just creating a lot of support doesn't really solve the problem. It's good, it's really wonderful, but the organizing is really what has to happen. And that happens through people sitting down together and talking and starting to look at what are they unhappy with in their current situation and how work is organized for them, and how can we change it? How can we make it more cooperative, make it more what we want? And that's actually more important than the question of resources at that stage of organizing. Again, this is one of the differences. If you're going to organize a business organized around capital, the first thing you need is capital. You need money.
Mhm.
But if you're organizing based on solidarity, the first thing you need is to build solidarity. And so that process is really, really important. And there is great important support from groups like the Center for Community Wealth Building in Denver, which does a lot of good education. But again, we need more of that, the kind of organizing oriented work, I think.
Yeah. That's interesting. I wonder if that's the way some of this work is being pulled in. I'm thinking about Chicago, where, you know, I've spent most of my working life in Chicago. I've only recently relocated to DC, as I mentioned. But the co-op movement there, my impression was there was stuff going on. There were a number of projects going. They were all kind of bubbling along very quietly. And yet it didn't seem to add up to very much for the third largest city in the country. And then the exiting mayor, Lightfoot, found $15 million for something called community wealth building and handed it to the co-op people mostly and said, you figure it out, whatever this means. And wow, this has been like a year ago. And Chiffer's Kitchen is now starting a second kitchen. And there's funding also for, I think, 2 more projects, co-op projects, including affordable housing. So there's really a kind of a bubbling up going on in Chicago, but it was pulled through under the banner of community wealth building. When finally, you know, at a kind of a policy level, you know, if we'd done it as co-ops, it probably wouldn't have gotten very far. That sounds too complicated. But if you put it under this larger umbrella, people say, I see, this is about communities kind of like reinvigorating themselves, you know, restarting themselves. And that's a whole different conversation.
Elias, I have a few comments on that coming from Chicago. Steve Ediger here from Chi Commons.
Hey, Steve.
And I'm very involved with the cooperative ecosystem in Chicago. It's been very difficult to get our Chicago cooperative convergence, our consortium or federation of co-ops off the ground in Chicago, because everybody seems to be so busy building their own co-op that they don't have time to exercise Principle 6. But the community wealth building project is ongoing. It remains to be seen how that's going to impact Chicago. There have been some notable grants, but it's too early in the process to see exactly what that's going to produce. One thing is that, you know, the city, although they have this money for building cooperatives, they are approaching it from kind of a typical city nonprofit industrial complex sort of a fashion, and they haven't quite gotten the picture of co-ops yet. And so there's not a lot of money on the ground for co-ops in formation, and it's tending to go towards larger concerns. So that's some initial reactions that we have in Chicago about that. But we, as a worker co-op ourselves, are finding that many people are coming to us. Just heard another bicycle co-op in South Shore that wants to form this morning. We have many people coming to us and asking for our consults on building their co-ops as worker co-ops. So I think that there's a lot of things going on, and it's great that the city is supporting it. Now that we have a new progressive mayor coming into power, we'll see if that community wealth building project continues on and gets even funded better, or whether it's going to go the way of many city projects.
Right.
I'm complete.
Right. Great. Thank you, Steve.
Elias, I wanted to just mention from the book, one thing or the interviews, I think actually 2 things stood out. One is where there was huge government, a couple of cases where there was huge government support. That would be South Korea and Venezuela.
Yeah. Huh.
didn't produce tons of new cooperatives that lasted a very short time. So, in Venezuela, the people from Seco Sesola talked about these, what do they call them? Cooperativas de carpeta. They were like paper cooperatives or you could have a filing folder with a cooperative in it, but was it really happening?
Yeah.
So there's a kind of, so it's a question mark around what role does a sudden infusion of money have, and even government support. It's just a question mark. I'm not saying it necessarily goes one way or the other. There has been a lot of good co-op development. But the other thing we saw was, I think, groups that think in terms of commons, creating common pool resources, creating resources and thinking in terms of a commons and not just inter-organization relationships. That may be a more fruitful way. So Barcelona, for example, is famous for the Catalan Integral Cooperative and for a group called Fem Pro Comuns, who we interviewed. And there, I think that they found a really good organizing approach that makes it possible to benefit from the support that they get from local government. So they're very successful. They have a lot of support, but they are able to use it and able to organize with it very effectively. So I think that intersection between cooperating and commoning is really an interesting one to explore more.
Yeah, that takes a little translating in the U.S. context, doesn't it? In that the commons is, people think you're talking about the lake or the park, or what is the commons,
Yeah.
But yeah, I see what you mean. Certainly in Europe, it's been a powerful lever. So perhaps that could be the case here as well. Any thoughts, Simi?
No.
Okay. Just looking to see if any other questions are popping in here. Some good comments are coming through. Anybody else? Or maybe I just ask you both for reflections on this experience and what you picked up and what was most interesting or worthwhile about it. And what do you hope the book will do? Besides being read or argued about or whatever. That could be good too.
We're gonna wait each other out. Who's gonna?
Yeah, no kidding. For me, to be honest, I'm at a point where I would love to hear from more co-ops who have read the book and who say, "Oh, this resonated. This didn't resonate. This was on the mark. This wasn't on the mark." Or we did a coffee and learn with the co-op that I work for, Sustainability Solutions Group, and it was just really great to hear how it reflected to them, and I think similar types of engagement processes with co-ops that we featured or co-ops that didn't get featured, but are definitely in the different spheres that we talked about. It would be great.
Very good.
Yeah, I think, it's funny. I was just talking to George about this yesterday, that we haven't yet gotten a lot of feedback. So we kind of, the book is out there. We know some people have been reading it, but we're still kind of in this phase in this moment of not yet knowing how it's landing with people and what is it hitting. Are we raising issues that people really want to engage with, or is it, just how are people reacting to it? We don't quite know yet. So this event was really special. So I'm really grateful to you, Elias, for offering to do this, for organizing it, because and particularly for your questions, right, which reflect the kind of careful reading and relating it to the issues that are of concern to you. So that's very helpful and interesting on our end. So I guess I would hope that the book would be useful to people who are looking for a way to frame the issue of cooperatives, how to relate cooperatives to more than just a business model, to kind of look at it in this bigger sense, And then I suppose really primarily in relationship to the multiple sort of interacting crises that we're dealing with that we call climate change.
Yeah.
But that are really they're kind of coming down on us in very distinctive ways. Certainly in the food system organizing we're doing here, it's utterly part of what we're talking about all the time in terms of water and wind and weather, everything we're dealing with. So yeah, I think that, and then just about the experience, I have to say that it took us a long time to write this book. We started before COVID.
Wow.
Then COVID happened. All of us had personal things going on in our lives. It was a really kind of long and difficult, complicated process. But because of that collaborative process, which involved a lot of the kind of yes and idea that people talk about in improv theater, this kind of being willing to accept and work with what's being offered. That really enabled us to get through what was a difficult process at times and come out with something better than any of us could have written on our own. So I think that's one sort of big lesson to me from the experience. That's how I would like to write a book again if I were going to do it, is with that kind of collaboration and real deep cooperation.
Very good. Very good. All right. Lovely. All right. Well, thank you both. This has been great. I think there is a future for this book because you make the point yourselves. I think it's in the book somewhere that historically co-ops have been a response to crisis.
Yeah.
So there's that. And then the other thing is cooperatives at work. I think part of our education process is helping people get their heads inside what it might be like to be part of an enterprise like this, why it would feel different, why it is different, what's liberating about it. What an idea, work as liberation, or at least a liberatory workplace. So I think this book is very much part of that conversation. Marcelo, right, has written a good deal on that with his amazing book on the Argentinian recovered factories. So that is just a much bigger political conversation and vision than people normally think about in this context. So hopefully good things will happen. So thank you everybody for attending. Great comments, and I hope we'll see you all again.
Thank you so much, Elias, and thanks to everybody who sat in.
Yeah. Thank you all.